So, imagine you're trying to train an AI to have truly excellent scientific taste. The obvious, immediate thought is, well, why not just track down the absolute best scientists in the world, watch how they think, and essentially copy-paste their brilliance right into the model? Sounds like a no-brainer, right? These elite experts have this almost magical knack for spotting the right problems and ditching the weak ones way before anyone else. But as we're going to see in this explainer, you can't just digitally clone human intuition. Hitting copy and paste on a human brain doesn't actually work. Today, we're diving into exactly why human taste cannot simply be distilled and what we absolutely have to do instead if we want to build genuinely capable AI systems. Here is the roadmap for where we're headed today. We are going to hit Section 1, the core distinction. Then, Section 2, why expert data is small. From there, Section 3, what distillation actually captures, followed by Section 4, the expert distillation paradox. And finally, Section 5, the energetic paradigm method. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the core distinction, imitation versus structure. So there's a really hard line between two totally different ways of doing this. The first approach is person-centered distillation. This is honestly what most of us picture when we think about training AI. We try to replicate a specific person. It's essentially behavioral imitation. We're asking the model to soak up a scientist's verbal tics, their tone, their writing style. But then you have the completely opposite approach, structure-centered formalization. You see, scientific judgment isn't a personality trait. It relies on a hidden underlying structure. So the energetic paradigm method, which we're going to dig into a bit later, focuses entirely on formalizing that underlying architecture of judgment, ignoring the surface-level quirks of the actual human making the call. And here is why that distinction is absolutely crucial. When a scientist looks at two hypotheses and says, you know what, hypothesis A is better than hypothesis B, that is just a label. It gives us the final score, but it completely ignores the decades of hard-won, compressed experience that actually drove that choice. It doesn't tell the AI why a certain anomaly was important, or which hidden assumptions were totally fragile. So the training data captures the what, but completely, utterly misses the why, the actual mechanism powering the decision, which naturally brings up a huge issue when we actually try to train these models. Moving on to Section 2. Why expert data is small, looking at the volume versus leverage dynamic. Just think about the crazy mismatch in sheer volume here. Large language models are pre-trained on literally trillions of tokens. I mean, an ocean of data. That enormous volume is what builds their broad capabilities: language, general knowledge, basic reasoning. But on the flip side, the number of truly exceptional world-class scientists, that's a tiny, tiny group. And the number of actual judgments they can personally sit down and provide is even smaller. So how on earth is this tiny little drop of elite expert data supposed to make a dent in that massive ocean of general pre-training data? If we just toss those few expert labels into the mix, they get completely swallowed up. Well, the secret to solving that scale problem is compression. The true value of expert data doesn't come from its raw volume, it comes from its structural leverage. Think about a fundamental equation in physics. It might be just 3 or 4 characters long, practically no data at all, but it organizes a massive universe-sized space of observations. It's the same here. A single structural insight from a top expert, like exposing a recurring flaw or spotting a brand new causal variable, can reorganize thousands of future AI judgments. It is all about high leverage compression. So what happens if we ignore all that structure and just try to distill the expert anyway? Let's get into Section 3. What distillation actually captures, and the failure of the surface. When we fall back on ordinary distillation, sure, the model successfully learns the expert style. It picks up their tone, their typical feedback, their historical behavior. It basically masters the vocabulary of being rigorous. It learns the exact pattern of approval that the scientists used in the past. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. It completely misses the hidden assumptions. It misses the opportunity costs. The AI is basically just mimicking the visible decisions without ever acquiring the structural variables and constraints that actually produce those decisions in the first place. This failure state actually has a name. It's called a statistical portrait of the past. And this is a really crucial concept to grasp. Capturing a person's communication style or predicting how they responded to past training examples is absolutely not the same thing as capturing their scientific judgment. It's like having a really good impersonator. When a model relies on this statistical portrait, it just falls apart the second it encounters a genuinely new, out-of-distribution scientific problem. Why? Because those copied, surface-level behaviors just don't apply anymore. You can really see how these two mindsets are fundamentally at odds. Behavioral imitation is constantly asking, okay, what would this person say? It's just trying to predict a human reaction. But structural transfer, which again is what we actually need for scientific AI, asks a much deeper question. What variables, constraints, and causal relationships actually produced that judgment? These are not the same task. One gives you a chatbot that sounds like a smart scientist, for sure, but the other gives you a genuine engine capable of real scientific evaluation. Which brings us right to section 4, the expert distillation paradox and the danger of consensus. Let's think about what scientific taste really is at its core. It has to operate outside what's familiar. An AI needs to be able to evaluate hypotheses way before the scientific community has formed a safe consensus. So if a model is trained primarily to just imitate past expert judgments, we run into this paradox. The better it imitates the historical expert, the more it gets trapped inside the boundaries of that expert's past experience. A refined copy of yesterday's judgment is simply not capable of creating tomorrow's judgment, especially when true quality shows up in a completely unfamiliar form. And there is another massive complication here. Elite scientists do not agree with each other, like at all. For instance, you might have one scientist evaluating a field based purely on theoretical elegance, but then another scientist demands experimental tractability above all else. A third might love high-risk, swing-for-the-fences fundamental questions, while a fourth strongly favors cumulative, reliable, step-by-step progress. And this disagreement isn't just random noise. It actually reflects completely different objectives, constraints, and structural dimensions in their thinking. So think about what happens if you take all these brilliantly disagreeing experts, throw them into one giant data set, and train a model on their averaged labels. You literally destroy the exact thing that made each expert valuable in the first place. You don't get some omniscient super genius AI. You get an AI that is cautious, moderate, and, well, institutionally acceptable. It just spits out the safe, mushy center of existing science, completely failing to detect where that center might actually be totally wrong. All right, so how do we fix this? Let's hit section 5, the energetic paradigm method, and how we extract the control structure. Instead of trying to distill a person's vibe, the energetic paradigm forces the system to evaluate ideas through explicit structural dimensions. It uses questions like, what actual mechanism produces the phenomenon? Or, which costs are hidden or transferred here? Or, does this proposal actively reduce complexity? These kinds of questions actively convert this fuzzy, abstract idea of scientific taste into a very concrete operational procedure. The AI doesn't need 1,000 examples of a scientist saying an idea is bad. It needs to know the why. What makes it bad? Like, does the explanation rely on untested assumptions? Does it transfer costs to some unmeasured variable? Those are reusable structural judgments. So how does this actually play out in practice? Well, under this paradigm, the whole role of the human expert fundamentally shifts. In the first step, the expert isn't just handing out simple good or bad preference labels anymore. They are providing a structural correction. The system essentially asks them, hey, what hidden cost made this solution unacceptable to you? Or what specific evidence would make you reverse your decision? Then, in step 2, the system extracts those specific, reusable variables. And finally, in step 3, the AI takes that explicit control structure and applies it consistently across entirely new, unfamiliar domains. It's a tiny volume of information, but it has absolute massive leverage. Which really brings us right back around to our core thesis for this explainer. Imitating a person? That just preserves past behavior. But formalizing a method? Actually extracting the gears and mechanisms of good judgment and making them operational? That preserves generative capacity. It builds a judgment system where the internal structure can actually be put under a microscope, tested, corrected, and continuously improved over time. Frankly, it can even disagree with the person who originally designed it if the structural analysis points in a different direction. And honestly, that is a feature, not a bug. I want to leave you with this final, kind of provocative thought. The energetic paradigm completely upends the whole objective here. It's not trying to preserve the scientist in amber, it's trying to preserve and upgrade the underlying structure by which scientific value is judged. It stops asking the superficial question, what would the expert say? And instead demands to know what structure makes the judgment. By shifting our focus away from the person and onto the procedure itself, we can finally empower AI to evaluate the true unknown and push the very future of scientific discovery. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and we will catch you next time.